When it comes to biological evolution, one aspect of this theory that really troubles Christians is the idea that human beings evolved from some kind of ape-like creature where this evolutionary process began, roughly 6 to 7 million years ago and proceeds through a number of transitional intermediates, creatures like Lucy and Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Neanderthals, which eventually gave rise to modern humans through a gradual descent with modification process. Because this seems to challenge what Scripture teaches about human beings, that we are the crown of creation, that we are made through God's direct intervention, that Adam was created from the dust of the earth, and that Eve was created from his side. These ideas that are found in Scripture seem to be at odds with this notion that human beings evolve, again, over vast periods of time through a series of transitional intermediate forms. And so how, as Christians, can we make sense of the supposed evidence for human evolution? How do we make sense of what's known as the hominid fossil record, which many people would argue provides very powerful support that human beings indeed evolved? Well, one approach that some Christians take is to argue that the hominid fossil record is simply not reliable, that in effect it's all made up, that these are just simply ape fossils that have been mislabeled and misinterpreted, and that there's a conspiracy to delude the general public that there's evidence for human evolution when in fact there's not. And people who argue this way will point to the Piltdown Man, which is evidence of a forgery of a particular fossil to make that fossil look like a transitional intermediate. But the fact of the matter is, even though there are these high-profile instances of forgery when it comes to the history of understanding human origins from an evolutionary perspective, another example would be the Nebraska Man as well, where scientists interpreted a pig's tooth as being the tooth of a hominid and built an entire ancient hominid around this pig's tooth that was labeled the Nebraska Man. These again are instances where the scientific method broke down and scientists were involved in horrendous misinterpretation of fossil remains or in outright forgery. But these are two instances among vast numbers of fossils that have been discovered that really do appear to document the existence of these hominid creatures in the fossil record. In fact, there are probably 15 to 20 different hominid species that have been discovered in East Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, the Middle East, in Asia, and in Europe that, again, appear between 6 million years ago and about 100,000 years ago when modern humans appear on the scene. But just because these hominids exist in the fossil record doesn't mean that they necessarily represent transitional intermediates going from an ape-like creature to modern humans. Clearly these are creatures that existed, but you could understand them as creatures that existed that were created by God, that again persisted on Earth for a period of time and then later went extinct. And if these hominids are to be true evidence for human evolution, there's two requirements that have to be satisfied. There should be a very clear evolutionary pathway through the hominid fossil record connecting an ape-like creature to modern humans, and there should be clear evidence for transitional forms, again in the fossil record, that document that pathway. Well, it turns out that many of the hominids that appear in textbooks that are touted as our ancestors, creatures like Lucy, or like Homo habilis, or Homo ancestor, or Homo erectus in Asia and in China, or Neanderthals, are considered by evolutionary biologists today to be evolutionary side branches and dead ends. That is, most people do not believe that these creatures are part of the direct evolutionary ancestry of modern humans. In fact, evolutionary biologists cannot point to hominids in the fossil record that clearly have a direct connection to modern humans. There is an absence of clear transitional forms, and there is not a clearly documented evolutionary pathway that exists in the fossil record that can account for the origin of humanity. Another requirement is for there to be the gradual emergence of brain size, the ability to walk erect, and advanced human culture. because these are defining features of human beings, and if these emerge through an evolutionary process, we should see a gradual increase in brain size, a gradual emergence of the ability to walk erect, and again, the gradual emergence of a sophisticated culture. But when we look at the fossil record, we don't see gradualism, but we see sudden appearance. Let's take bipedalism, the ability to walk erect, as an example. The evolutionary model has long held that when hominids were forced from a woodland environment into the open savanna, this drove the ability of these creatures to stand erect and then to begin to walk around on 2 feet for a number of reasons in terms of promoting their survival. Now, in order to go from a knuckle-walking ape to a creature that can stand erect and move around through bipedal locomotion, it requires a wholesale reworking of the anatomy of that organism. And you would expect that for this reworking of the anatomy to take place over a vast period of time. But instead of seeing, again, the gradual emergence of bipedalism, what we see is that bipedalism appears rather suddenly in the fossil record. And the very first hominids that are able to walk erect are living in a woodland environment, not in an open savanna, meaning that there's no evolutionary driving force for the origin of bipedalism. And when bipedalism appears, it appears rather suddenly in the fossil record and appears to undergo vast periods of stasis or no evolutionary change. People used to think that creatures like Lucy were walking around with a very crude form of bipedalism, and it was only later in the natural history of hominids, with the emergence of Homo erectus, that the type of bipedalism that modern humans use appear at that time. But it now turns out that Lucy seems to be walking erect just like Homo erectus, just like Neanderthals, and just like modern humans. In other words, there's not a progression of crude bipedalism to sophisticated bipedalism, but rather bipedalism appears at once and is in a very sophisticated form at its earliest appearance. This does not match what you'd predict from the evolutionary model, but rather is consistent with a creation model where God is creating these hominids for purposes of his own. Now, one other thing to talk about real quickly, and that is the origin of sophisticated human behavior. This is a defining feature of human beings, and I believe that this reflects the fact that human beings are made uniquely in the image of God. And while it's true that hominids like Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Neanderthals made tools and had a culture of sorts, the types of tools that they made were crude and cumbersome. And when they made these tools and these new quote-unquote technologies appear, they appear and then they can persist for up to 1 million years in some instances without any kind of appreciable change. But when humans appear on the scene, suddenly we see an incredibly sophisticated toolkit that's used, incredibly sophisticated manufacturing practices. We see for the first time art and music and religious expression, the capacity for symbolic representation of the world, the capacity for symbolic thought. This is called the socio-cultural Big Bang. It happens explosively, virtually out of nowhere, when modern humans appear on the scene. And this, to me, is exactly what I would expect the fossil record to look like if indeed human beings are made in God's image, that this sophisticated behavior shows up all of a sudden, all at once, and is associated with human beings. Yes, it's true Neanderthals used tools. Yes, it's true that Homo erectus and Homo habilis used tools, but what they were doing is crude and cumbersome and is comparable to what we observe chimpanzees and gorillas doing in the wild today. Their behavior is no more sophisticated than that of the great apes. And so when we look at the hominid fossil record, it's clear that these creatures existed, but it's very difficult to argue that these hominids somehow demonstrate the validity of human evolution.